Ladies and gentlemen, maybe we need to have a drum roll here or something like that. We're getting ready to go chapter 3. Business 211, supervision, or I like to call it really effective supervision. Chapter 3, online with Professor Joe Lane. In chapters 1 and 2, we got to talking about how a supervisor is a leader, a motivator, a change agent. You may have noticed that our supervisor has changed a little bit. They're in shock. They have already learned so many things that they're supposed to be doing as an effective supervisor. I've noticed their mouth has just gotten straight and their eyes have gotten larger. So maybe we've got to help this supervisor over the next couple of chapters, let them know, hey, you can handle it. You can learn this stuff, but it's a pretty important job. Chapter 3 is the chapter on communications. An effective supervisor must be a leader, must be a motivator, must be a change agent, and must be a communicator. So as we go into chapter 3, I'm just going to take the handout, or your study notes for the chapters. I'm just going to kind of use them as we get started. Our author made a pretty bold statement as we start chapter 3. He says this: of all the skills needed by supervisors, communication is number one. All others depend on it. And you know, whenever anybody does that and says, of all, this is the most important or whatever, I always stop and think, now wait a minute, do I believe that or not? I teach management. The 4 functions that all managers perform are planning, organizing, leading, and controlling. But do they have to use communications in all 4 of those? I teach marketing, and I get to thinking about what's marketing all about. It's an exchange between the buyer and the seller, the company and the consumer. Communication is incredibly important. And so as I start looking at the different aspects of business, I realize that to communicate what you're trying to communicate is incredibly important. So I think I'd probably agree that as it comes to skills, maybe the most important skill that a supervisor has is the communication skills, because they've got to communicate with their employees, they've got to communicate with their peers, they've got to communicate with upper management, and they've got to do it well. So I think we'll go along, I think we certainly go along with that. What is communications? The transfer of information that is received and fully understood from one source to another. Now, I've got a little something I'm going to get out of the way and I'll show you in a minute, but let's talk about, I'd be familiar with the fact that our author thinks that this is the most important skill that supervisors should have is communications. I'd also be familiar with the definition of communication. It's information that is received and information that is understood. You got to get it and you got to understand it, and our author says that's communications. But then he said something else. He said, look, we don't want communications any more than we want a supervisor. We want effective supervision, and so we also want effective communications. So we want something more. So what is effective communication? Effective communication is communication that is received and understood and acted upon in the desired manner. Hey, did you get my communication? Did you get my message? Yeah, I did. What, did you understand it? Man, I did. What'd you do about it? No, nothing. But you know, there was something I just didn't do. That's not effective communication. Effective communication, received, understood, acted upon in the desired manner. So I would be familiar with what communication is. I'd be familiar with what effective communication is. Now, it's kind of like change. Hey, I'm a supervisor and I've got certain authority as a supervisor to tell people to do things, to order people to do things. Well, sometimes as a supervisor, you want to use that legitimate authority or power you have of your position. But I'm going to tell you, in being an effective supervisor, many, many, many more times than using your official authority, as I mentioned here, if you use persuasion and communication and motivation and that sort of thing, it's going to be more effective. It's going to be more effective. And that's what he says here. Utilizing those leadership characteristics we talked about. All right, let's look at the communication process. So I would be familiar with communication. I'd be familiar with effective communication. I'd be familiar with that is the most important skill that supervisors should have. The communication process, here it is, right here. I want you to know this communication process. If you've had speech or you've had some of those kind of classes, I'm sure you've already seen it, you've already talked about it, probably some other classes that you've done, but here I want us to make sure, because if communications is the most important skill that you can have as a supervisor, let's make sure we understand what communication looks like. You're the sender. This is you as a supervisor. You're going to send a communication to your employees. All right. When you encode the message, that means you put the message in certain words, in certain figures, you figure out how you're going to convey it. Encoding it is putting it together, your thoughts into a message. You encode it a certain way into a message. Now, when you're encoding that message, who should you be thinking about? That receiver. Because remember, you want received, understood, acted on in the desired manner. You already understand it. You already know what you want the desired action to be. But you've got to encode it with this person in mind. That's why it's great for you to get to know your people, know the personalities of your people, understand your people. So you encode the message. So you come up with a message. Now, I ran this through here, medium. How are you going to convey that message? Face-to-face, online, text, email, put it on the company bulletin board. There's a lot of different medium, a lot of different ways. Which one are you going to use? Might you use more than one? The answer is yes, you might. So which ones am I going to use? How do I know? Very simple. You're going to use the one or ones that you know they will receive it, understand it, and act on it in the desired manner. So that's the mediums that you use to make sure that those things, to the best of your ability, happens. Okay. The message comes to the employee, the receiver. They decode it. They take it and put it into their brain. Now that's why I said, if you encode something as the supervisor and you encode it in your way of thinking, how you talk, how you speak, how you do stuff, and you don't do it thinking about the receiver, when they decode it, you may get a decoding that's different than what you wanted. So encode it, keeping this person in mind. So hopefully when this person decodes it, they say, hey, I got it. I understand what my supervisor wants, and I got to get that done. That would be effective communication. Then that feedback is going to let you know if they took care of it and it was the desired action. If you needed that person to do a particular job for you by a particular time, and you saw by whatever means that job had been accomplished successfully, and it had been accomplished successfully by a particular time, you know that you had effective communications. Okay. I would know this communication model. this communication process. It's important that we understand this as a supervisor to be able to effectively communicate. I didn't write them down, but I'll give them to you. When you're giving me this communication model, because this is a no, you might want to put me some little asterisks in there too, and put an asterisk and say noise. There's all kinds of noise that can mess up a communication. And so our book talks about some of the inhibitors of communication. Well, I did not write them down, but I'm gonna use the text in case you don't have your text yet, or you're not going to buy a text, which I think you should, but that's your business. But in this particular case, I think I can help you a little bit. What are some inhibitors? Well, what does inhibitor mean? Things that can mess up effective communications. He said, here's some things that can do that. Difference in meanings. Understand that different words have different meanings. So make sure you convey it with the meanings that are intended, keeping this person in mind. Insufficient trust. One of the things that can mess up communications is that this person doesn't trust, or you don't trust this person. Now I'll say this, you've got a lot more problems in communication problems if you don't have trust in your department. That's a killer. That's a killer. As we said at the very beginning in chapter 1, you may not be possible. You may not always be liked, but you've always got to be respected. And the way that you get respect is you build trust. And if you don't have trust, you got a lot of problems. One of them is communication. Number 3, information overload. Tell them what they need to know. Don't tell them everything you know. Tell them what they need to know to effectively do what needs to be done. Interference. There could be all kinds of interference. Electrical problems, problems with the communication device that you're using. There could be noise, just literal physical noise problems if you're trying to communicate face to face in the middle of a busy place. So there could be interference, different types of things that could interfere with the communications. Next one, condescending tones. Do you know what that means? That means if you're doing something face to face, well, I guess I need to tell you this. I guess I better tell you this again. You're saying it in such a way you can tell you're saying it almost in disrespect. You know, or I don't want to. I guess I better tell you this. And you're rolling. You know that's not good. Listening problems. People hear, but sometimes they don't listen. My wife tells me that occasionally. Okay, I try to do better at that. You don't want to hear what you don't want as a supervisor for that person to hear you. You want that person to listen to you. And as an employee or the person receiving the message, you don't want to hear it. You want to listen to it. Listening problems, premature judgments. But you read half of a sentence of the first paragraph and you've already decided what you're going to do and what action you're going to take and what you think about it. No, read the whole thing. Inaccurate assumptions. You make assumptions about things that aren't true. That's not good. Get the whole picture. Technological glitches, we've already talked about that. So anyway, here are some inhibitors to communications that I'd like for you to know. Differences in meaning, insufficient trust, information overload, interference, condescending tones, listening problems, premature judgments, inaccurate assumptions, technological glitches. That's 2, 4, 6, that's 9 of them. Now the question you're going to ask is, do I have to know 9? No. How about 8? Okay, how about 5? I'd know at least 5 of those inhibitors to communication. All right. So we've come off with 2 no's. Number 1, you have to know the model of communication, and number 2, you've got to know some of the inhibitors to communications. Now he starts talking about something else here and I can kind of use this, although it's not very good. He talks about communication networks. And the only thing I wrote down in here was formal and informal communication networks. Now again, if you have your text, he goes into some detail on that. But let me do a little bit, because this is something I want you to be familiar with. Within an organization, you have a formal organizational structure, right? Okay, in a formal organizational structure, get over here, maybe you can see more than just my nose. In a formal organizational structure, you have a formal chain of command. And you have people that report to people and that sort of thing. That's the formal organizational structure. Within that formal organizational structure, you have a formal communication network. You, as a supervisor, you communicate with your employees. That line goes down to your employees. Then that line goes up to your supervisor, and there may be a number of, or manager, and then it goes up, to the next level of management, on up to the top level of management. Every organization has a formal communication network. How communication flows down, how communication flows up, and communication flows horizontally between departments and that sort of thing. That's a formal communication network. Also in every company, you have informal communication networks. What do you mean by that? People that maybe at break time just stand around and talk, that run into each other at a particular place on the job and just chat. So I guess what I could say is within any organization, you have the formal communication channels up and down, but you've got all kind of informal communication that goes on. If you've ever heard the term grapevine, the grapevine within an organization, all this stuff that goes out on the grapevine, sometimes that stuff is not accurate. Now, this informal communication, if you're just doing it about informal things because it's a friendship sort of thing and you're just chatting about stuff and things like that, that's fine. You shouldn't be doing it all on company time, but if you have a break or have a situation where you can chat with someone. But if you're putting out company type information that you think you may be accurate on or not, or you're speculating on or something like that, then inaccurate information that gets out there within the organization can be harmful. And so you have both informal and formal communication channels. Sometimes that informal can be inaccurate. Now we'll just kind of a little postscript on that. If you're a supervisor, I'm just going to stamp out that informal communications. You can't stamp it out. You're always going to have just informal conversations and stuff. People just talk. Remember we talked about Maslow, we're social animals? We're just going to do that. But the way to keep inaccurate information down is for you as a supervisor to provide good communication, ongoing with your employees to let them know the things they need to know. And don't put them in the dark about things. All right. Then he talks a little bit about communication by listening. Now we jumped into that a few minutes ago as we were talking about communication kind of as we began this chapter. And we talked about the communication model. He says this, hearing is natural. If your hearing is relatively good, and if something in this room fell, I would hear it. Listening is not natural. You have to work at listening. And we talked about here, how you do that. And we talked about there's a lot of inhibitors to effective communications. And one of those inhibitors is listening. You've got to develop listening. And let me tell you, as a supervisor, there's three, they talk about in real estate, the three most important things, or in retail, the three most important things are location, location, location. Well, I tell you, I might almost want to say in some ways, the three most important things for supervisors are listen, listen, listen. Now, I'm not sure that's the three most important, but it's really, really important. Listen. Listen to what's going on. Listen to what your employees are saying. Listen to what your employees are not saying. We'll talk about that in just a minute. You can listen to what they're not saying. But listening skills, just like leadership skills, can be developed. In chapter 1, I don't even know if I mentioned this or not, but leaders come in all different sizes and shapes. You can't look at a person and know whether they're an effective leader or not. But the great thing is, it seems like some leaders are born, but you can also develop leadership skills, thank goodness. Same thing here. You can develop communication skills. You can develop listening skills. He gives you a hint here. He said, you know what? One way you can figure out if you're a good listener or not is ask yourself certain questions. Do you answer before the other person finishes talking? Do you make a judgment before? Or he said the best way to find out whether you're a good listener or not, ask somebody you trust. Hey, am I a good listener? Be honest with me. Am I a good listener? Just ask. But don't get your feelings hurt. Because they may say, well, sometimes you're in a hurry, but it can help you develop to be a better listener. All right. Oh, by the way, employees want you to listen. I put that down. They don't want you to hear them. They want you to listen to them. Now, on the back side of my handout, next page, I guess, on yours, communicating non-verbally. You have verbal communications, you have written communications, then you have non-verbal communications. Non-verbal communications is very, very powerful. You, as a supervisor, better be able to read non-verbal communications. You better understand it. You better be able to read it. If you're ever going to be an effective communicator. It's probably the least understood type of communications, but it is very, very powerful. Okay, what makes up nonverbal communications? Body factors, voice factors, proximity factors. You say, what more are you talking about? Let me grab my text for a second. And then we'll talk about them for a minute. Components of nonverbal communications, body factors, your posture, your dress, your gestures, your facial expressions, your body poses, things like that. Okay, let's just stop with those. Nonverbal communications, not what you say, but nonverbal. The posture that you have. How you stand, how you sit when you have someone, when you're communicating with someone. Is that important? Can you tell, I quit moving, I gotta get my lights back on. I guess I can pick up my study guide that slipped. All right, let's talk then a little bit about your posture. How you position yourself says a lot about how you want to communicate. How you dress. Your gestures. Now, we all know some hand gestures that I won't be showing here on this video is to keep me from getting in trouble, that are not very complimentary. But there's a lot of things that folks can do with their hands. If when somebody's talking to you, you're kind of like this. This says, for a lot of people, I'm blocking what you say, I don't want to hear it, and I'm really not very interested. I'm not interested enough to stand up and pay attention. If you're talking and your hands are apart, a lot of times that says, I'm wanting to include you. I'm receptive. Hands apart means come on in. I'm receptive to what you're doing. This speaks differently to that. Now you say, well, some people just like to cross their arms. I know that. But for the most part, look, there's my hands. All right, where my hands are right now says, I'm wanting us to communicate with each other. I want us to be together here. I want you to be able to come in on this. I'm not trying to block you out. So those sort of things are very important that you understand that as you talk to employees and as employees talk to you. Look at their posture. Look at their dress. Look at their gestures. And check out yours as well. How about facial expressions? You know what? Smiling is a good thing. Smiling is a good thing. It conveys positive things. We have a granddaughter, Elizabeth Ann, who's 4, and I love to talk with her because her eyes are so into her conversation. Her eyes are just all over what she said. You can see it in her eyes. You can see the interest and the excitement of what she's talking about in her eyes, as opposed to somebody who's, rolling their eyes, all these facial sort of things. When you're doing something like this, like you're on my last nerve, or I can't wait for you to get out of here, or wrinkling the brow, or some of those things like that. What are your facial expressions when you're talking to your employee? What's your employee's facial expression when they're talking to you? Now I'm going to say this 2 or 3 different times. I think it's on the handout. It uses a big old word, but it's very true. Are the spoken message and nonverbal congruent? Is what you're saying with your spoken word, your verbal communication, is it backed up by your nonverbal? Or is your nonverbal in contrast to it, or in contradiction to it? You need to be able to read an employee's nonverbal, and they're going to read your nonverbal. Okay. Voice factors. Now, body factors are one thing. Voice factors, the volume of your voice. A lot of times, if we get to talking we get to talking loud and louder, it shows excitement. The pitch. If your voice really gets high, you're really nervous, you're really excited. Yeah, okay. Ooh, the tone of your voice. Oh yeah, glad to see you. Really glad you decided to come in this afternoon, Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. The tone of my voice, plus rolling my eyes. Can you check it out? Oh yeah, I'm glad to see you at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Can you read all over that? I just said, I'm glad to see you this afternoon, Friday at 4 o'clock. So what I said was, yay, you're here. What was my nonverbal saying? Oh my gosh. Of all the things that could happen to me right now, you're the worst. So you're nonverbal. That's why you as a supervisor have got to be able to read nonverbal. The rate of speech. A lot of times, and if we were in class, I'd be asking you and we'd be demonstrating these things, but that's one of those things we can't do exactly with the online. A lot of times if our speech, if we speed up, that means we're nervous, we're excited, something like this. You've got to be able to read the voice factors of a person. All right. And then proximity factors, that's the third one he talked about here. Physical arrangements, fixtures, that sort of thing. Give you one example about proximity, the proximity of one thing to another. If you come in, or when you come in to be advised by me, if we get back to this coming in before long, if you've ever done that, you'll notice if I'm sitting at my desk and you come in to be advised, I move around to your side of my desk. And I ask you to sit right here, and I'm going to sit right here. I sit on the same side of the desk as you as we do advising, unless for some reason I have to go back for my computer. Why do I do that? Because from an advising point of view, that desk becomes a barrier. That we need, when we're advising, we need to be together, looking at stuff together. Eye-to-eye type things, so we can do a great job of advising you. It's not about a faculty member and a student. It's about two folks that are trying to get something done for you as a student that's really, really important to you. And so I remove that barrier of the desk by coming and sitting by you. So hopefully this is the last time I'll say this, because I tend to repeat things that are important. You're not going to be as effective a supervisor as you could be if you can't really read nonverbal as you're talking to other people. and making sure that your nonverbal supports your verbal in the message of the communications that you're trying to convey. If you're trying to convey an event that's coming, it's your company, and you're talking about it, and the words that you're saying about it are words that are supposed to elicit excitement about the event, but your nonverbal is saying, I don't care anything about this. That's that inconsistency. And employees don't like inconsistency. Nobody does, really. Okay. So that's kind of the idea behind nonverbal. Very, very, very powerful communications. Let's see what else he talks about. Okay, communicating verbally. All right. Here are some things he says. I wrote it down on your, by the way, I definitely want you to be familiar with nonverbal communications. I'd like for you to be familiar with the three primary types of nonverbal communications: body factors, voice, and proximity. Probably be a good idea that your verbal and nonverbal be familiar with the fact that they should be in congruence. Your nonverbal and your verbal should speak the same language. All right. Congruence, by the way, is CONGRUENCE. Now you're not going to be writing that because this is not one of the K words, but but congruence. May want to use that word this weekend. It sounds pretty important. All right, let's talk about communicating verbally. What are some things that you can do now to communicate verbally effectively? Verbal communications ranks close to listening, and it's important to the modern supervisor. All right. Supervisors can improve their verbal communication skills by being attentive to the following factors. Number one, did I write these down for you on my handout? Yeah. Number one, show interest. Well, I don't know whether I'm interested in it or not. Yes, you are. If it's something your employee or your boss, but let's stay with employees as a supervisor, is coming to you to talk to you about, it's of interest to them. If it's an interest to them, it should be of interest to you. Okay, number one. Number two, attitude. Have the right attitude. Have the right attitude. That employee is talking to you. Maybe you happen to walk out in the department and they talk to you there. Maybe they came to your office. Maybe they saw you on the way to the car. Whatever it is, but have an attitude of, hey, look, they're here to talk to me. Let's do that. Be friendly. Make them feel like that you're glad that they came to you, to chat with you. Number three, flexibility. Let's say you're talking to an employee, and that employee brings something else up, and you say, no, we don't have time to talk about that right now. Whoa, wait a minute. Maybe you do. If that employee took the time to bring something up, be flexible, listen to them. I came to talk to Fred about so-and-so, but when I started, Fred wanted to talk to me about something else. Let's listen to Fred. Let's be flexible. Same thing if you're in a meeting. Now, meetings, we'll talk about, you shouldn't overrun meetings or things like that. But if something comes up in a meeting and it needs to be discussed, it's kind of like something in a classroom. If you bring up a point in a classroom or you bring up a question, it's really a good question. But it's not something I planned on covering. It's not, I ain't going to cover that, forget about it. If it's something that could be helpful, let's do it. So as a supervisor, be flexible. Be flexible. So what have we said so far? We've said number one, show interest in the verbal communication. Number two, have the right attitude about the verbal communication. Number three, be flexible. Number four, tact. Use tact. Tact is an important ingredient. Tact has been called the ability to hammer in the nail without breaking the board. The key to tactful verbal communication lies in thinking before talking. Sometimes you have to tell people that comes in and they have an idea or they want something, you may have to tell them no. It may be a good idea, but you have to tell them no. So they give you they talk to you about something and you look at them and you say, no. Is that tact? I had a boss one time. I had a position of chief financial officer in most of the positions that I've held before coming to Delta. And a lot of times as chief financial officer, you have to tell people no about things that they wanted, resources they wanted. The finances were not there for it, could not be provided. And my boss would say, on occasion, well, first of all, my boss didn't want to tell them no. So if they came to him and they wanted something, he'd say, it's okay with me as long as Joe Lane approves it, because I had to approve it for a financial situation. Now, a lot of times he knew that it wasn't going to happen, but he didn't want to tell them no. He's going to let me do that. And I understood. He was the boss. But he had told me several times, he said, you can tell people no the nicest way. And so use tact. I mean, if there's a no, tell them why. I said, that's not a bad idea. Maybe that's something that we might be able to do in the future, or we might be able to revisit. But right now we can't do that. It's not something we're able to do. I mean, just be tactful in how you approach them. Maybe somebody comes up with something that's really stupid. It's really stupid. And you can look at them and say, that is insanely stupid. But don't do that. They may have thought it was a good idea. They just hadn't thought through it. One of your employees. Just use tact and letting them know it can't happen. And why it can't happen. And that sort of thing. Courtesy. It never hurts to be courteous. Never hurts to be courteous. Be courteous to people. You can disagree with folks, you can have things like that, but be courteous. So communicating verbally, you can improve it by being courteous, being flexible, being tactful, showing interest, and having the right attitude. And one more thing, I'd be familiar with those things. And one more thing he mentions here, you can improve verbal communication by questioning. One of the ways you can show interest is by questioning. Whoa, did you just say so-and-so and so-and-so? That way you get a better understanding. They know that you're into it and you're listening to them. So questioning is a great technique to use when communicating verbally. The last thing he talks about, I'd be familiar with that as well. The last thing that he talks about in this chapter that I want us to look at for a minute is he talks about selecting the appropriate communication method. And I wrote down a few things here, and I want to talk a little bit about something that I think is really, really important for you as a supervisor. Here it is. When you are commending a person on doing a good job, and when you are reprimanding a person for poor performance, I want to talk about those for a second. When you are commending a person for doing a good job, it's perfectly okay and probably preferable if you do that verbally and publicly and then follow it up in writing. If you're walking over and one of your employees has just done something outstanding, and the other employees know they did, and you walk over to that employee in front of the other employees and say, Nancy, that was unbelievable, what you did. I would have never thought of that. That was a great job. I appreciate you doing that, or appreciate how that happened. Commend that person verbally, publicly. That's good. Motivates Nancy, communicates to the other people. It's a positive stroke, And then if it's something significant enough that may want to go in their personnel file or something, then follow up with that in writing. Okay. Reprimanding somebody. for poor performance. Never in public. That's not reprimanding somebody, that's humiliating somebody. I was told of a situation here at Delta years ago. Do not know if it's true or not. The person that told me, I trusted what they said. But it was only hearsay because they were telling me what happened. That our chancellor at that time, and we've had a number of chancellors, our chancellor at that time confronted an employee down in the lobby area and commenced to reprimand that employee in front of everybody. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. I mean, I had no way of proving that, okay? But let's just say it was true, because something like that could have happened. Well, probably it was a good thing that I wasn't there, because I probably could not have stood by and watched that happen. I probably would have had to walk up and as quietly as I could say something to the chancellor about, shouldn't this be done privately? And then I'd have probably gotten fired. So maybe it was best that I didn't know about it. But you know how badly that must have embarrassed that employee. Kind of humiliated that employee. And that would mean that the chancellor either didn't realize what they were doing, which is not good, or they did realize what they were doing, which is even worse. So, anyway, my thought is here, as a supervisor, commend in public, verbally, follow up in writing, reprimand in private, and probably follow up in writing as well. But both those need to start verbally. I think that's the main things, and I'd like for you to be familiar with those two things about reprimands and commending folks that we talked about here. I think that takes care of chapter 3. Let me look. Going back here, I think the communication process was a no here in chapter 3. Maybe the inhibitors to communications, and I think the other things we talked about were be familiar with things. Communication is incredibly important, and incredibly important that we do it correctly. We understand it's a skill that we must have as a supervisor. It's a skill we must have as almost anything. In our home relationships and everything else with spouses and partners and children or whatever, communications is vital. And so I think that kind of takes care of chapter 3 on communication. So now we're a leader, we're a change agent, and we're a communicator. There's a lot of things that first line supervisors have to do. All right. As you know, the way we get through with these, each of these chapters, we have to have a loud sound. You can clap along at home if you're kind of getting into this now, if you like to. But I'll do a loud clap that says that we have finished chapter 3, and my executive producer, Professor Pierce, can then know where to slot these in Canvas. So I am getting ready to do a loud clap. That's the end of chapter 3. See you in chapter 4.